On this week's episode, I had the pleasure of speaking to Anjali Samani, who is the Director of Data Science, and she leads the Predictive Modeling team at CircleUp. CircleUp is an innovative fintech company recently honored as one of the world's top 10 most innovative companies in data science. She has a fantastic background delivering commercial data science projects. She's worked across startups with the Financial Times Stock Exchange, large public sector organizations in the UK and the US to help them with data strategy and execution of data science projects. In many of her roles, she is the bridge between the technical data science and business to help identify and execute the solutions. She has a very interesting background in her role at CircleUp and what CircleUp has done. If you don't know, I will include links for you to go take a look and see, as a venture capital company, who they've invested in. Lots of consumer packaged goods companies and a lot of company and brands that you will have on your shelves or maybe at your home and you'll have tried. And these guys at CircleUp, they've done an amazing job of hitting on a lot of them. And I think a lot of it is attributed, and when I'm talking to Anjali about the modeling that they do, they have a solution that helps them track 1.4 million brands across 200 data sources and very early in the process. Hopefully in this episode and speaking to her, you can get some context and understanding the advantages that CircleUp has and how the rest of the industry has to catch up. And no further delay. Thanks for being on the podcast, Anjali. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here and to be speaking to you.
I appreciate you spending time and talking with us. And as we always like to do when we start off is try to understand kind of who you are and what you're currently doing. So if you could give us a little bit of an intro, that'd be great.
I lead the predictive modeling team at a fintech startup called CircleUp. CircleUp is on a mission to transform private market investing. It's a notoriously opaque industry that's very heavily reliant on personal networks, heuristics, and bias. So CircleUp have built an investment platform, which we call Helio, and we use data analysis and data-driven investment approach to really democratize private market investing. Our mission is to help entrepreneurs thrive, and we use the power of data and technology to provide the capital and resources that emerging consumer brands need to grow and develop.
Gotcha. Sounds like you guys are trying to change things for the better, which is always good.
We're very passionate about bringing a lot of transparency to this place and making data-driven investing the norm rather than something that's very unusual in this space.
So I guess just to talk about CircleUp a little bit more, just to put context, because I know we're going to talk about consumer data and private versus public investing. Can you tell us a little bit about what differentiates, the actual CircleUp model versus a traditional private equity firm or venture capital?
So in the more traditional model, it's not to say that data isn't used. Data is used, but it's not used at scale. It's not used systematically, and it's not used in a way that makes the whole process repeatable, scalable, all of those things. Where CircleUp differs is we are using data in two ways that really differentiates us. One is the stage of investing where we go in. So that's early stage brands where data is typically more challenging to come by. Once the brand is mature, then there is a lot more information available about that brand, and that makes it a little bit easier to make some of those data-driven decisions. We go in at a much earlier stage, which is challenging. And then the other thing that we're trying to do, or that we are doing, is doing this at scale. So in our platform, Helio, we track around 1.4 million brands. We look at over 200 data sources, and the data comes from a range of different sources. There's public data, there's private data, which we get from entrepreneurs themselves, and then there's partnership data. And we look at hundreds of thousands of data points across all of these sources and use that to make the investment decision-making process a lot more systematized. The process isn't specific to an individual making that decision. We can track exactly the data points that are driving some of the decision-making.
And I mean, you guys have been, I think when we initially chatted, I mentioned that I feel like every brand that you guys have been working with in the last couple of years, I've eaten some form of what you guys have invested in. But the name brands are amazing. I mean, Nut Pod, Smarty Pants, just tons and tons of brands where you guys have invested or got funding within a short period of time. I mean, it seems like sometimes you look at it and go, how is that possible? Obviously, kind of the data back end is kind of proving it, but is the success tied directly to Helio and how you guys are seeing the early signs of investing?
I would say yes, definitely. I mean, we use Helio very much at all the different stages of the investment process, right from sourcing to looking at how a brand compares relative to its competitor set, how differentiated the product is, what do the historical revenue estimates look like, what does the future growth propensity of this brand look like based on its digital footprint and all the data that we collect and track on the brand. So, yes, I would say that a lot of our investment success is directly correlated with the development of Helio and how it's been maturing over time.
So when you're looking at what you mentioned, yeah, obviously you guys you're doing a lot of work around the consumer packaged goods area and products are coming to market. How soon do you guys start, or how soon, I guess the 1.4 million brands, 200 data sources, how quickly does something show up on your radar, like in terms of to qualify that it should be one of the brands that you're tracking?
So we source brands from a lot of different sources. Some of it might be from the trade shows we visit, some of it might be through referrals and recommendations. And in addition, we've built tools that enable us to kind of to look at where a lot of the emerging brands typically first show up, whether it's in terms of distribution or in terms of their social engagement. And that's one of the mechanisms for discovery. So we identify those brands very early on. And in terms of how quickly it shows up on our radar on whether it's something that we should be tracking, that really depends on the data that we find. The models that we have today, we can assign a growth score to a brand within a month or even a quarter of it showing up within our database. But our estimates may not, of course, be as accurate that early on when you don't have sufficient data. As you know, the success of models at predicting success or failure accurately very much depends on how much data you have on a brand. So, in the early stages, the margins of error would be very large. And then with each subsequent data point that we add over time and across sources, those predictions and estimates get refined more and more. And then when it hits certain thresholds and in terms of where we think that that growth trajectory is headed, it'll start to show up on some of our screens.
Interesting. So when you mentioned obviously when they start out and you have relatively few data points, obviously the confidence is not going to be as high and the growth score. Over time, as you see the data, is there any patterns that you guys see that as more data points that the confidence starts to trend a certain way? I mean, is it typically more data points or is it time, or what corresponds to the confidence increasing?
All of the above, actually. So, not all data sources are created equal. So, depending on where you first start to show up, that will to some extent determine how much confidence we have in your likely success. Over time, obviously, as you collect more data, then you start to see certain trends and patterns emerging. That also adds to our confidence or otherwise. And it's a combination of both of those things where a brand shows up and the quality of that particular data source in terms of its predictive power as well as how long we've been able to track that brand for.
Interesting, because I mean, in your case, when you look at some of the companies, I mean, you guys have worked with, some of these are companies that are in emerging sectors. It's not even that there's a comparison to another sector. I mean, it's something that's, I mean, beyond meat. I mean, there's some things that you guys have done that you'd be like, cauliflower, oriented products. When there's an emerging sector where obviously there might not be comparisons, how complicated or how much harder is it to sign a valid confidence when you don't have any other competitors to necessarily pull from?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's an ongoing challenge we have. How do you identify emerging categories before they become a category in their own right? So, one of the examples that we often cite internally is kombucha. So, when kombucha first came out, it was typically classified as a non-alcoholic beverage, maybe in somewhere sort of 60s. But over time, as kombucha itself developed as a category, then you start to run into all kinds of questions about whether it's alcoholic, non-alcoholic, whether it's a fermented beverage or not. So initially, obviously, that classification does tend to be very coarse. But as a category matures and we start to see some of those attributes popping up multiple times and in different ways, then that helps us to build certain early indicators of whether A, this is a trend that's developing, B, whether it's a separate category in itself. And of course, there's an element of both science and art to that. So it's an ongoing challenge. It's an interesting one also when brands start to sort of diversify their product range. So one example is this brand called Banana, which makes these banana snacks. So typically we would classify them as sweet snacks, but over time they diversified into plantain chips, which is more of a savory snack. So, brands, as they diversify their product range, they will start to straddle multiple categories within CPG, and then it becomes more challenging. So we try and have some fixed categorizations, but we also build our models in a way that we have some flexibility and there is some element of dynamic categorization as well, so that you can compare a brand against a certain fixed category, but you can also compare it based on certain attributes that it might display, because that's when you start to see these interesting patterns which are more cross category.
Yeah, I mean, when you brought up kombucha, I was actually thinking that was one of the areas. And what I started thinking about there while you were talking is, let's say when a market sector is emerging, whatever is emerging, the first person, the first mover has a lot of education, goes through lots of getting and establishing the market, right? When the second company comes out, and let's say the second kombucha company comes out with a drink, they already have a market that might already be a little bit more aware of what the drink is. The third one, even more. Obviously, they're lacking maybe first mover. I was curious what Helio does in that case, because obviously the first company has a lot harder road to establish the product in the first case and brand. Do you guys actually differentiate with the first mover having to go through that challenge? And then obviously second, third, fourth companies that are not as focused heavily on establishing the concept?
That's a much trickier one because some of those patterns will also vary from category to category. So, in some categories where there are a lot of incumbents, it may be much harder for a brand to even bring in a new product. And there's a lot more hard work required to even get that education piece going. In other categories, it's much easier. We don't look at that specifically at the moment, but the way we capture some of that is in terms of category dynamics. So, how many players are there in the category? How is the market share within that category shifting? How easy or difficult is it for new brands to enter? What are the barriers to entry like? So, we don't look at it sort of in that direct a way. Is first mover advantage a thing in this category or not? Versus is it much better if you go in later in the process? But we look at it sort of in a more indirect way through the category dynamics.
So as a company, let's say we'll use kombucha as an example of just to kind of stick with it. So let's say, you guys are tracking different brands in the industry and the market's emerging and there's still incoming players. And then major brand decides, I'm going to get it to kombucha. It's growing. I think it's interesting. I'm going to put my, couple $100 million to start up a brand, buy a brand. How does that impact how Helios sees the smaller players? Is it validating the business model? Is it a threat? Is it obviously it's probably a lot of case by case, but I was just curious what happens when, like the larger brands decide to move into market.
Yeah, so we've sort of consistently seen larger brands losing share to the smaller brands, and how that impacts how we think about a particular brand is again sort of taken into account through these category dynamics. So a lot of the times in some categories, we see it's very easy for new brands to launch, but there aren't sufficient number of big players who may be able to acquire these brands. And if it is a very competitive landscape, then brand loyalty and all of those things start to come into play. So you're right in that it's very much a case by case evaluation, but we do see certain patterns emerging in certain categories. So, for example, a category where there are a lot of existing large players often tends to work in the favor of the emerging brands if they're able to get over that hurdle of establishing themselves, because they then become an easier acquisition target should they wish to exit.
Interesting. When you guys are evaluating a data source to understand, obviously, I don't know if you guys are also looking at social to start identifying trends and what people are talking about. Like, how do you guys qualify a good data source? Because that's a challenge for everyone, right? Like, what is a good data source? What are the indicators that you guys are putting some type of weight from the data from that particular area versus another?
So that really depends on what we're trying to accomplish with that data source. So, for example, in terms of our modeling suite, we have a lot of different models that come in at different stages of brands evaluation, right? When we identify a brand, one of the first things we need to do is to find some kind of a unique identifier for it. We need to figure out whether it's even relevant for us. So for us, relevancy means, is it a consumer brand? Is it headquartered within North America? These are the kind of basic checks we need to run. So a data source that may be useful for some of those models is very different to something that may enable us to estimate historical revenues, or something that enables us to predict future growth propensity. So, how we evaluate different sources will vary based on where we think the source is going to add value. So, my team focuses predominantly on estimating or predicting future growth and likelihood of future growth. So, I can definitely speak to some of that. With that, we look at again a lot of different indicators, right? So, we start with very simple things like correlations. And it typically, we look at number of different kinds of correlations. So there is Spearman correlation, there is Pearson correlation. We look at how well that particular source and the various signals that we can generate from that source are correlated with existing sources, as well as the target variable, which is the growth that we're trying to predict future growth. So that's typically a good starting point. But then we segment the universe in a lot of different ways. So there might be some signals which are very predictive for certain categories versus others. We'd segment the universe by the stage of growth as well, because the growth trajectories will vary again based on the category, size, all of those things, and different signals will come into play at different stages of growth as well. So we really segment the universe in a lot of different ways and then see how predictive this signal might be of future growth. The other thing we try and do is plug the signal into existing models to see whether it's additive in any way. So things like revenue and sales data within private markets is much harder to come by. So we would have that data through our engagement with entrepreneurs for some of the brands, but not all of them, which is where the predictive modeling comes in. So we also look at, how suitable is this source as a proxy for some of these things we're trying to measure, whether it's sales or revenue or distribution or a brand's strength and resonance with consumers. There is a lot of work that goes into identifying whether a source is useful or not. One of the biggest challenges that we run into with most sources that we come across is that even within consumer space, most data providers will focus on later stage brands. It's much easier to find data on brands that are more mature, that have been around for a while. It's much harder to identify sources where we have good coverage for early stage brands.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was going to ask you, like, is there like an optimal, like, have you guys seen an optimal number of years a brand has to be on your radar? So obviously you guys need some data points. A brand that just started 6 months ago might be challenging. Obviously, maybe they produce a lot of data and they get on there. Is there optimal, or is it again how much traction, how quickly a brand takes off? They're going to produce faster data points for you guys to assess, I'm assuming.
It's very much the latter. I mean, if a brand has only been around 6 months, then that's way too early stage for us, unless, of course, their revenues are going through the roof.
I guess that makes an interesting question of how do you guys measure that anomaly? So like if a brand does come in like 6 months, they've just exploded for whatever reason and they're just, going through the roof in terms of, revenue, you guys catch them on your radar, you're seeing the data points validate that. Is that too soon for Helio? Like do you guys need to then watch them just longer or is that a sign of, hey, there's supporting models that'll tell you if that is the anomaly or these guys are just lightning in a bottle and you guys need to move quickly?
So Helio will definitely flag that to our discretionary investment teams, for example. And then there would need to be a lot more due diligence that would go into the process if it's that young a brand. But I don't want to speak too much to that because that's not my area of expertise.
Makes sense. Gotcha. Interesting. So when you go back to we were talking about the data sources and in terms of leveling some of the biases that exist, like what do you see in terms of some of the biases that you guys are working to remove from the investment process?
So, one of the main biases within private investing as it stands today is this whole thing around gender bias and race bias and even geographical bias. So, within consumer space, innovation is happening all over the country, but investors are typically concentrated on either coasts. And I think there is some research which shows that investors typically invest within a certain radius of where they're located, which means that a lot of potentially very good consumer brands and entrepreneurs are missing out on that funding. It is a very network heavy process as well. So if you're not connected to the right people, if you don't have exposure to the right people, raising funding again becomes very difficult. So we have this very strong hypothesis that if you are identifying brands and looking at their potential to succeed based on something as objective as data, then it's much easier to remove some of those biases because things like gender do not feature in our models or in the way that Helio evaluates potential success of brands. So, just using this data to identify and evaluate brands, we've already been able to eliminate some of these biases, at least from our portfolios. For example, roughly 50% of our portfolio companies are either female founded or female led, which is in stark contrast to what happens in the rest of VC and private equity world. The brands that we've invested in are also spread across multiple states. So over 20 states with our existing funds. And then a lot of the target portfolios that we're building, the brands are spread across 45 different states across the US. So again, this is in very stark contrast to the typical VC portfolios, which are very much concentrated on the East and West coasts.
Interesting. It's funny. It's like when I look at the brand list on your website, the funded page, and I'm scrolling through it, it's crazy to think how many of those brands I've actually tried. And you look at the fact that obviously if they're making it to the shelf that far, there's massive traction. People are taking off with their products. Sectors are growing. Are you able to talk about, I guess, just the overall success? So you mentioned initially one of the limitations is data as a driver for some of this, and you guys have Helio, and it's looking at 200 plus data sources, 1.4 million brands. This systematized process of identifying earlier investment opportunities, when you compare that to other companies, where do you guys see, like, obviously they're picking up the data modeling, data science is picking up. Like, where do you guys see your advantage retaining? Is it just the sheer inertia of how much information you guys have had to bank now? Or, I mean, what are you guys doing to fend off the competition who's going to start trying to systematize their models like you guys have?
That's a really great question. So, for us, that happens in a number of different ways. One thing is the data. So, there are some data sources which are very ephemeral in nature. If you don't collect them today, they're gone tomorrow, or the data has changed so that the signal isn't either as strong or the signal has changed. So when you start collecting that data becomes very important. We have a considerable head start compared to others who are in the industry or who will likely start investing in this data driven way. So we have a lot of history in terms of the data which others who might enter the process later wouldn't have. So that's one thing, just in terms of how much historical data we have. The other advantage that also gives us is the fact that we would have a fuller picture of what's going on in the industry. So as you know, the survival rates for early stage brands are very low compared to, say, brands who have matured. So if I'm going into the data market sort of 5 years later, then I will automatically not have that data on all those brands who existed 5 years ago, but for whatever reasons are no longer there, either because they have failed or they have exited. So having sort of entered that game much sooner, we can try and fend off against some of the survivorship bias. That's one. And then the second one is I don't think many people appreciate just how much effort goes into not just collecting, but disambiguating and organizing such a vast body of knowledge. So, entity resolution is a great example. When you're collecting data from so many different sources, you have to disambiguate them and be able to track a particular brand across multiple sources, whether it's your private, public, or partnership sources. And that is immensely challenging. So, just identifying these sources is the first thing, but then being able to link them in a way that you're able to build this kind of 360-degree picture of a brand, that is immensely challenging. That requires a lot of engineering and data science machinery to be built. And that takes, again, a lot of time. And I think that anybody who is entering this space and thinking of doing this, they would run into a lot of these issues very quickly. So we've been collecting a lot of this data and organizing it for a long time. So we have that history. We have a sense of what the moving parts are, and awareness of where we should be more careful with some of the biases that naturally creep into the data. And then it's just the sheer volume of data.
Yeah, I know the one thing I was going to circle back to was how do you guys get to the point where when a new brand does come up and you're trying to, disambiguate the data between two overlapping or competing brands in a very small space where they're early stage? I guess the danger of false positives exists in terms of attributing one data point to another company. Like, how challenging is that? Because obviously, the earlier the brand, the less confident you are data point wise on what you're collecting.
That is a huge challenge. And things like our entity resolution models, for example, they are constantly being updated. We retain all the data we collect so that we are able to, as our models improve and as we are able to take advantage of advances both in data science and in engineering, we're able to go back and refine some of those data points as well. So it's definitely a huge challenge. All early stage brands, again, are not equal. Some of them are very good at telling their story in a way that is very unique and it makes it very easy to disambiguate them. The more information they put on their website, for example, makes it much easier to sort of connect it to all the other places where they've left their digital footprint. So I think over time, we've certainly seen brands getting better at some of these things, but it still continues to be a challenge, particularly at the scale at which we're trying to do this. So, hundreds of brands are emerging every day. We're tracking hundreds of thousands of them. So, to try and process that data at that rate, that's also a big challenge.
So, you guys are collecting this data. Is there any type of feedback loop to the companies you guys are? I mean, obviously, you've invested in them or tracking them. Like, is there a feedback loop back to the companies that you're working with in terms of, here's what we're seeing? You mentioned, potential there is, but I'm curious how often that happens of taking and helping them identify something that they themselves can't see.
That's something that definitely happens. It's very much in the ballpark for the investment teams. So that's one of the unique offerings that we have for brands when we partner with them. we regularly share some of these insights. And there is a feedback loop sort of going both ways. They're able to share more data with us, we're able to share more insights with them, whether it's around their competitive space or where there's opportunities in terms of growing their distribution or their brand presence, or how the brand is resonating with the consumers, or how they may be able to differentiate themselves more. That's definitely one of the unique offerings we have for entrepreneurs, whether we engage with them through our equity teams or through the credit teams.
I was just thinking, who gets to enjoy all the free samples?
We all do. That's one of the great things about being in our office. Whenever we're engaging with a brand, we get tons of free samples. Everybody in the office gets to try it. And as you can probably see behind me, we have a lot of interesting products. That's one of the fun things about being in the space.
It's kind of funny. It spans the gamut because there's, adult beverages, there's chips. I mean, you guys for party can pretty much at any given time, have a good, you guys are stocked up if something happens over there.
Absolutely. You should come down to our office someday when you're in the neighborhood.
I will. I'm going to come with an empty stomach and be sampling. Appreciate that. I'm just cognizant of the time. I know you got to get back. And by the way, very interesting. I think, like I mentioned a couple of times, I'm going to put up a link to the funded page in the show notes when we go live, because I think people that are not familiar with CircleUp and take a look will be like, I have tried a lot of these products. It's pretty amazing how frequently you guys are getting it right, which I think is a testament to what you and the team is doing. I mentioned I'd like to ask a few standard questions. I'm going to throw one at you because I'm just curious in terms of what you're currently reading. You said maybe we won't find it interesting, but it actually now has struck a chord. I got to go into it. I can't help myself. So tell us, what is like the latest book you've read? Or we could be any book if you like. You can change it up. But what are you reading, or what do you like to read, or what's been interesting to you that you have read?
So, one of my goals this year was to not read just work related books. I read a long time back, but I've been meaning to reread, is the autobiography of a yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. And it's a very old book, but it's one of those that was really fascinating for me. Coming from a world that's very much focused on technology and science and logic and models and all of these things, it was really fascinating to read about this whole different world, a spiritual world, and how everything else around us potentially works. And it was a really interesting read, interesting perspective, because a lot of the times he tries to connect the physical and the metaphysical, trying to break things down and explain it in terms of quantum physics and how the world of atoms work, and how some of these things that are to the scientific world today only very recent discoveries, but the ancient sages of India knew about a long, long time back. And there are scriptures which have very scientific descriptions of some of these things. So it was very eye opening for me. And one of the other things that kind of got me thinking about it as well was I was reading something about Steve Jobs recently, and I learned that it was one of the books that was given out to everyone who attended his funeral. And I was talking about it so much as we were traveling that my husband said, "Oh, maybe I should read it too." But he's Russian and he only reads books in Russian. So I had to procure a Russian version of the book, and he's currently reading it and seems to be enjoying it.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, the best is when you find a book that's so engaging that you pass it on in some form. I think that to me is the thing that I enjoy most. Is I hadn't really read. It's funny, like there was a time period where I had a 6-year-old, so there just was no time to read. And I told my wife one day, I was like, I just feel like I'm not learning as much. I mean, I read a lot, like in terms of articles, but like full books, I wasn't doing that. I mean, listen to podcasts, but I was like, I'm missing that. So she was like, well, why don't you try Audible? Like, you don't have time to read, you can listen. So that's been my thing for the last year and a half, is just, listening to books. Because if it was to read, I would run out of time. But I like the fact that when you find that one thing you really like, you're like, hey guys, you got to, in my case, I go, I read it in air quotes because I feel like I'm a fraud because I really don't read. I'm listening it and narrated like a story to me, but it gets the job done.
Do you listen like when you commute or when you're doing other things? Because I find it really hard to listen to books unless I am forced to sit in one place and listen, which typically happens if I'm driving.
So I listen a lot when I'm driving. So I have different tasks that I feel comfortable with when I'm doing like deep work for me where I know what I'm doing. It's just more repetitive task thinking. I could put something on in the background where if it's something where it's a new idea, business model, something where I need to think, like I can't use the subconscious energy. But I've realized what's interesting is that if it's on, I might not remember every word, but I'm still somehow in the back of my mind absorbing, it's still processing. So I'm like, it's still better than not sometimes. But I'm definitely going to link to the book, and whoever's interested obviously can pick it up. I'm fascinated. You mentioned you went back to read it. And again, I don't have the context of having read it myself, but I'm just curious. When you went back and read it again, how was your perspective changed on what you were reading?
So, one of the things that I like to do, I'm very much a physical books person. I don't like digital books. And one of the things I like to do is when I read books is I sit with a pencil and anything that resonates, I'll underline it. So, what was really fascinating rereading it was looking at things that resonated with me 5, 6 years ago when I first read the book and kind of thinking, I wonder why this resonated with me. Or in some cases, I knew exactly why certain things resonated really well. And it was also interesting that this time around, some of those things were still very much, I would have still underlined them this time around if I was reading them for the first time. But there was a lot of new material there that I hadn't picked up on last time. And that's one of the reasons this is a book that I like reading multiple times, because both times I've read it, I've learned something new, both in terms of the content of the book and also in terms of myself and how I have evolved and grown and changed over time.
That's cool. Yeah, I do that with Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist. I read that every like 7 or 8 years. I'll pull it out and I'll read it. And I've done that probably multiple times. And I feel like every time it's a slightly different version of what I am absorbing. And I sometimes look back and go, well, how did I miss that the last time? Because I feel like I'm reading the same book, but yet, my life experiences allowing me to interpret that information differently. The AI up here in the brain tends to change the model and look at the data points all differently than what it was, the last time you read it, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite books too. It's one that I haven't read more recently, but I have read it a few times. And again, I look at the underlines and think, okay, this is interesting. It's not resonating as much at the moment, but it clearly did once upon a time. Or, this whole thing about missing the information that was there, but you didn't pick it up because your experiences or consciousness or whatever you want to call it wasn't quite at that point.
There's a lot of disambiguity that has to happen in your brain to see that data point. I mean, it's kind of funny because I think when you really think about what you guys are doing, like at a very high level, and when you miss those data points, there's a lot of similarities in terms of the context of how our brains take on these same functions, but yet they happen so automatically. And there's no way for us to check when we do miss it. There's no second model or there's no other person to look over it to go, hey, by the way, did you realize that's an outlier? And just kind of keep going on with life. And you read the book a second time, you're like, okay, well, that would have been something I would have picked up like a decade ago. And I would have learned that. But that's too funny. I appreciate you being on. Thoroughly enjoyed chatting with you. And we'll include, I think, your LinkedIn handle, your Twitter handle, in case somebody wants to reach out and has any questions.
Great. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it.